Welcome to the in-depth build video about my belt grinder stand. In case you missed the first video about this, or if you forgot what this whole experiment is about, I've made 2 videos for this project. It's not a 2-part series, it's just one short video and one long video. The short video is intended for education and entertainment purposes, while the long one is more intended for those who actually want to replicate the project. It's almost like video plans, if you will. I'm doing this experiment because I hate writing plans. So if I can make a video that does the same thing as plans, I prefer that. So I want to know your opinion on this, especially if you replicate this project based on the video that you're about to watch. If you care to, leave me your opinion down below on this video, what you think of it, and please don't butter it up. Give me your honest opinion. If you hate it, please tell me that. Enjoy the video. Back in April, I built this heavy-duty 2x72 belt grinder. And since then, it's been sitting on my dad's workbench on top of this stack of 2x8s. This machine was intentionally overbuilt, and yet because of what it's sitting on, I can do this. I think it's time I build a dedicated stand for it. The signature feature of this grinder is that it can serve as either a vertical or a horizontal grinder, but because of that, the motor, which is direct drive on the drive wheel, has to swing down, as you can see here. So it needs some extra height in here. About 3 options to deal with this. One is to just set it on top of blocks like this, although you could go with a little more professional blocks than just a stack of 2x8s. You could make the legs on the grinder longer so that you can mount directly, or the solution that I'm going with is to custom build a table that's notched out so that the motor has a place to swing. Just to give you a quick look at the construction before we get started, it's going to be a front and back frame, nearly identical, just that one of them is notched for the motor. They're connected by a bunch of cross members. On this corner where the notch is, that'll be skinned to keep dust out, and the back will also be skinned to add rigidity and keep dust out. The top will have a piece of 1/4-inch plate, and then in the front there will be 2 banks of wooden drawers. I'll mount my frequency drive up on a pedestal, as you can see here. The tube used for the main frame is 2.5-inch square tube, 1/8-inch wall, and then the secondary parts are made out of 1.5-inch square tube, 14-gauge wall. To figure out how long you need to cut the legs, take the height of your table, in my case that's 40 inches, and subtract the thickness of the table top. I'm going with 1/4-inch plate, so that leaves me with 39 3/4, and then subtract the thickness of the feet on the bottom of the legs, if you're going to have any. I'm going to weld 3/8 plate on the end of my legs, so that will leave me with 39 3/8. And after truing that up on the belt grinder, I've gotten it down to exactly 39 3/8. 3 of the 4 legs are 39 3/8, and the other one is 7.5 inches shorter. That's the one that goes on the corner with the motor notch, which is 7.5 inches deep. Across the top here, I'm going to put a 38.5-inch long piece, and then down the middle there will be a smaller tube between the 2 banks of drawers, and then another tube across the bottom that'll keep these 2 legs from bending in and out. Now the back frame will be mostly the same, but just a little different because the 2 don't line up. So it'll have to be a jogged piece across the top, and then the same piece down the middle and across the bottom. I'm going to go ahead and weld up this front frame right now. Where these corners come together, if I just weld on top of that, I'll basically just get a little pile of weld. That's not ideal. So I'm just going to take and bevel these inside corners. And now I have a V-notch to weld in. I'm taking my time and measuring to be sure the legs are parallel and square to the top. Since I welded these inside corners first, the legs warped inward just slightly. They're about a 1/16 inch closer together at the bottom than they are at the top. So I cut this brace that goes across the bottom. I cut it so that it just fits at the top. Since that's the right length at the top, If I just force it in down here at the bottom, then that'll push those legs back into parallel. So I just clamped these ends together with a piece of scrap metal to make sure that these faces are flush. Same thing on this end. And then I've checked to make sure it's the right distance down from the top and that everything's square. So we're ready to weld this up. Now the distance from the top of the bottom tube to the bottom of the top tube is 31 5/8. So that's how long I cut this piece, which goes here in the middle. It's important to make sure that this piece is exactly centered side to side. Okay, that's the front frame all done. Now, like I said, I will be adding some feet on the bottom, but I'm gonna leave those off for now because they might get in the way. I'll add those later. You can see here where the two banks of drawers will go. And now let's move on to making the back frame. I cut out this center jog piece, which is 7.5 inches from the top to here. Again, since the motor notch is 7.5 inches deep. You'll notice something about this. If I put it on top of this one, it makes this leg the same height as all the others. So it's sort of like I've just cut this piece off and scooted it over to here. And now I just need to make the piece to fill this in and this. The distance from here over to here is going to be the same as the distance from this tube to this tube, since the same drawers that fit between these need to fit between these. This is 16 inches, and with 2.5 inches extra on each end, the top piece that I need to cut for here is going to be 21 inches on the long side. So just to run through the dimensions of this one more time, this piece is 17.5 inches, and it'll be 20 inches overall. This piece is 7.5, 10 inches overall, and then this is 21 inches overall. The inside here is 16. And here again, I'm beveling those inside corners to give me a V-notch to weld in. So now I just need to put in the 1.5 inch tube across the bottom and up the middle. Now the middle one is going to end right here instead of going clear up to the top. So it's 7.5 inches shorter than the one in the front. Again, I welded the inside corners first, so I have to jam this piece in. So this is the piece that goes here in the middle. So I'll use that on this end to get the height right. And then once I have this right, I can use this dimension to make sure this end is the same. That way it'll be straight. So I have this end clamped up so that it's flush across the top and across the side back here. And then this end is centered and clamped so that these two are flush. After a few tack welds, I checked both sides to be sure they are 16 inches wide. Notice that the 1.5 inch tubes on the front frame are flush with the front, but on the back frame, they're flush with the back. So now we're ready to connect those, so I just need to cut a bunch of 20-inch long cross members for the top and bottom. So the two larger pieces go here and here. There will be another one going here, but that has to have a jog in it, so I'll need to custom fabricate it. The two smaller tubes go right here and right here. And then there's two of the smaller tubes that are cut slightly longer to go here and here. These are necessary to support the plywood panels that'll support the drawers. You'll see that in a bit. I want to make sure that the front and back frames aren't twisted relative to each other when I weld these in. It'd be best to have a precision level, but I don't, so this is just a regular old level. It'll be close enough for this. It should be within a 32nd of an inch over the length. Here I'm checking the diagonals to be sure that I have it sitting square, and then double checking the ends to be sure they're still 20 inches apart. All right, that's all nice and square. I'm just putting a few tack welds here and there and then checking everything for square again. The more square this is, the better, because if it's out of square at all, the drawers probably won't work as well. It warped out of square just a little, but by putting diagonal clamps across it, I was able to pull it back into square. So I've got these bottom ones tacked in place, and I'm gonna now tack this one in, and with that, it should be rigid. And just so you know, I am welding all of this stuff completely solid. I'm just not showing it because it takes too long in the video. Just to help you see what's going on here, you can see there's a cross member right in the middle between the vertical in the front and back, straight across there. And there's another one between them right against the bottom of the jog. And those are there to screw plywood panels into. We're also going to screw plywood panels into these sides. So that'll screw into the big tube on the top and on the front and back, and then into that little tube on the bottom. So I'm working on this jogged cross member now. I've already cut all the pieces. The overall length this way, of course, is still 20 inches, just like the other cross members. And the height of this is 7.5. By that I mean 7.5 inches offset. It's 10 inches overall. This piece is 9.5 inches overall. And this piece is 13 overall. The front foot of the grinder is going to sit right here, and then the back foot sits about here, so there needs to be a cross member between here and this tube. That cross member will be 15 inches long. So now you can see the motor notch. If I put a plate on that side, a plate on the bottom, and a plate up this side, that will complete that. But there is one more piece I'm going to add here, like so. That's mostly just for looks. I ground my welds flat everywhere where there will be panels, so that includes the inside where the plywood goes, the top, and the back. So I'm welding these 3-inch square feet on the bottom. If you wanted, you could certainly put leveling feet on this or casters. Just cut these legs a little bit shorter, weld them on the bottom. In my case, I've got a way to move it, as you just saw. I don't like leveling feet. I prefer to just kick a shim under the corner. I can already hear you asking the question, why don't you like leveling feet? Good ones are expensive, cheap ones are wobbly, and pretty much all of them require tools. These are dirt cheap, and it doesn't take any tools to kick a shim under the corner. So all the feet are attached. Now all we need to do is put the skins on the back and in this notch. This opening is 31 5/8 by 16. So I'm gonna cut the sheet to 17 by 32 5/8, so it overlaps a ½ inch all the way around. Then this one's also 16 wide, but only 24 1/8 tall. So I'll cut it to 25 1/8 tall by 17 wide. Now, you can certainly make this in just one sheet to cover the whole back. I'm just making it in two because of how I plan to use the rest of the material that I bought. To attach these, I could just tack them on all the way around, but that's not going to do a very good job of keeping the dust out. So I could tack them on and then run around it with a bead of silicone. That would keep the dust out, but it might not look as good, so I'm just going to weld it solid. In hindsight, the silicone would have looked better than my ugly welds. Also, if you're just going to tack it on, maybe leave a little gap around the edges or something, because otherwise there's a risk of it vibrating and making a buzzing sound. See, you don't want that sound. Still pretty noisy. So here's the piece I cut to fit in the bottom of the notch. You can see the corners are both cut out a little bit, and those are to fit around the welds. And this profile is the same as this. And I think I'm just going to try to bend a single plate around this. For this vertical piece, I need to bend it here and here. Now, if I just clamp it in the vise and try to bend it, it's not going to look very good. So I'm going to score that with the grinder first. That'll give me a spot for it to bend. Since I've weakened the plate by grinding grooves in it, there is certainly a chance that it'll crack along those grooves. But I'm just going to hope for the best. If it cracks, I can weld it up then. This bottom piece is 15.5 by 7.5. This piece ended up being about 20 3/4 along its length before I bent it, and it's 5.5 inches tall. So I'm going to paint this with this Duplicolor machinery gray, it's called. It's the same paint as I used on the belt grinder. As a refresher on how my modular drawer system works, the drawers are all built on an 1.5 inch increment. So this is a 3-inch drawer, this is an 1.5 inch drawer, another 1.5 inch drawer, and in here we have a dado cut every 1.5 inch. So as long as all the drawers are built on that same increment, any drawer will fit anywhere. My tool stand is going to be built the same way, so I need to cut plywood panels for the sides that have a dado every 1.5 inch. This is 3/4 inch Baltic birch plywood, but any good quality cabinet grade plywood will work fine for this. I cut my 4 panels, and now they need to be notched out in the corners to fit around the horizontal tubes. So I'll go ahead and notch them, and then I'll show you what I mean. So here you can see why I needed to notch the corners out. And also I chamfered the inside here so that it would clear that weld. These panels are 33.5 tall by 23.5 front to back. And I'm gonna start all 4 panels out at the same size. So the panel that goes here will be identical to this one. And then the 2 that go in this spot will have to be customized a little because of the motor notch. The notches on the bottom are about 7/8 by 3/4, just adding a little bit to that to give it some clearance. And the ones on the top are about 1 inch by 1 3/4. Also a little extra for some clearance. And they're symmetrical left to right, so the notches on these corners are the same as these. So now we just need to cut those grooves in here, and then we'll screw it in all the way around the perimeter. The bottoms of the drawers extend past the side a little, so they actually serve as the runner. I'm going to use 1/4 inch plywood for the drawer bottom, so I've just set up a dado stack that's a little over 1/4 inch. And I'll set that to about 1/4 inch high. Now we're ready to cut the dados. The first dado is going to be 1 inch up from the bottom, and then every dado following that will be just 1.5 inches over from there. 1.5 inches on center, that is, which means I need to move the fence over by 1.5 inches for each one. It'd be wrong not to mention safety here, since the only table saw kickback I've ever had was doing this operation. The most important aspect of doing this safely is to keep the part straight. That was what happened the time I had a kickback. The part twisted slightly and caught the blade. However, since these dados have to be full depth in order for the drawers to work, it's important to put pressure down directly above the blade. So as you can see right here, I'm turning the part around and I'm working my way back across. If you work your way across referencing off the same side all the way, it's probably more accurate, but more dangerous. Since the notch in the corner is 7/8 inch tall and this dado starts 1 inch up from the bottom, that means the bottom of the drawer will clear this tube by 1/8 inch. And then if everything's the right size, you should have 1.5 inches from that tube down to the bottom of this dado. So with those 2 fitting, it's time to customize the ones for the notch side. Now you can think of this notch as if I've just taken this top piece, cut it, and scooted this part down by 7.5 inches. Or you can think of it as taking the leg, cutting it, and scooting it over by 9.5 inches, since the notch is 7.5 by 9.5. So what I'm going to do to customize this is take this profile and push it over 9.5 inches to here. And I'm going to take the top profile and push it down 7.5 to here. Ignore these lines, they're not right. This panel should fit now. Nice. The panel for the left side of the right bank of drawers is pretty much identical to the right one, except that it's mirrored, but there's one other difference. Instead of being cut out here, it's just cut straight all the way across the top. With all of these other panels, they're notched out around these top tubes because this part can actually be screwed onto this big tube at the top. You can see here, but for this panel, that's not possible because this tube actually sticks out. You can see from up here, it's flush on this side with this tube, but it's 1 inch out on this side. So that panel just has to stop against the bottom of this tube. I got all 4 panels installed and fitting correctly. So now it's time to screw those in place, which I'm going to do with these little 1032 by 1 inch countersink head screws. I marked out where I want to put the holes all the way around this piece, about every 6 or 8 inches. And now I'm going to countersink those. I'll countersink them first, because if you drill first and then countersink, then the countersink chatters. So I'll countersink first, then come back and drill all of these with the drill press, and then I'll go install this in the tool stand and use it as a template to get the holes in the right place in the steel tubes. Okay, tapping for a 1032, we need a number 21 bit. I clamped the panel in place to be sure it doesn't move, and now I'll use that number 21 bit to drill through the tube in each of those locations. I put this panel in behind me so I can push back against that. That way it's easy to drill forward like this. Although I could also see it might work to lay the whole thing on its side so you could drill down instead of sidewards. I decided to try that idea, and I ended up using this method for all the rest of the panels. It's a lot easier than crawling inside the cabinet. This is a spiral point tap, which means you don't need to back it out to clear chips, so it's well suited to running in a power tool. The most important thing is to keep it straight. Now that these holes have finished serving their purpose as pilot holes, I can use a drill bit, which is bigger than the major diameter of the screws, to enlarge them so that the screws fit. Okay, all 4 panels are screwed in place. Now on to making the drawers. Every drawer needs to be able to fit everywhere since they're interchangeable, which means every drawer needs to be able to fit in the narrowest spot on here without binding. The way to determine where that narrowest spot is, or rather how wide it is to just cut a panel and try it in every spot. If it binds, cut it down and try again until it doesn't bind. And that one's tight. So there's 2 places where it fit just a little tighter than I'd like, so I'll just have to trim that down to where it fits nicely, and then I can cut all the other bottoms to the same size so they'll all fit the same way. Sweet. You may have noticed that the grain is running side to side on these pieces instead of lengthwise. That's not the way it should be, but I'm just using the pieces I have. These are the 15 drawer bottoms. They're roughly 15 inches wide, of course cut to fit. They're 24 inches long, except for these 3 which go where the motor notch is. Those are 9.5 inches shorter, since the motor notch is 9.5 inches front to back. They're not going to be the most useful drawers ever, but I mean, what else are you going to do with that space? You might as well put drawers there. Now we just need to cut the sides out of 1/2 inch plywood, the backs also out of 1/2 inch plywood, and the fronts out of 3/4 inch plywood. I cut these sheets across the grain to 24 inches wide, so now all I need to do is cut the individual drawer sides out of this. They're already the right length. To fit on these slots that are 1.5 inch spacing, the drawers need to be built on an 1.5 inch increment. So these drawers up here are 1.5 inch, 3 inch, 4.5, and 6 inch. That's the sizes I put in my workbench, but I'm going to go with all these same sizes plus a couple of 9 inch deep drawers. Now, those are the nominal sizes, but actual sizes are a little less than that. So these 3 inch drawers are actually only about 2 7/8. That's because they need to be a little shorter so they don't drag on the drawer above them. So the height of the side of the drawer needs to be the nominal size minus the thickness of the bottom minus that clearance gap at the top. I'm going to go with an 1/8 inch for the belt grinder cabinet. So for each of the nominal sizes, I'll subtract 3/8 inch to determine how tall to cut the sides. I cut the sheets in half first just to make them more manageable, and now these are 8 5/8. These are 5 5/8. These are 4 1/8. These are 2 5/8. And these are 1 1/8 inch. I said I was going to use 1/2 inch plywood for the backs, but then I noticed I have these leftover pieces of 3/8. I'm going to use that. I think it'll be fine. I'll explain why in a minute, but each drawer has 2 backs. So there's a back and then a false back about 5 inches in front of that one, which means we need to cut the same number of backs as sides for each respective height. I cut these to 13 3/8 first, which is how wide the drawers will be inside and therefore how wide the backs need to be. So these are all of the sides and the backs for all of the drawers. I'll make 1 1.5" drawer, 5 3" 2 4.5s, 2 6" and 2 9". And then in the short drawers that go under the grinder, there will be 1 1.5" and 2 3". I'm making a lot of the 3" drawers because, for one thing, I plan to store belts in them. Also, in my workbench, I found the 3" to be the most useful. I also use the 1.5" quite a bit, but I don't think I will in this grinder cabinet. I have a lot of big chunky attachments and tables and that kind of stuff to store, so I needed these bigger drawers. I have this piece of plywood that I'm going to use for the fronts. You can kind of imagine I just have to cut it in half like this, and then slice it off into a bunch of little pieces to make all the drawer fronts. The fronts are going to cover up these plywood edges, so they're going to come right up against the tube on both sides. Well, not quite right against it, there will be a little clearance gap. And since this is a 16" opening between the tubes, I'll cut the fronts to 15 3/4. Here I'm cutting them across the grain to that 15 3/4" width, and now parting off each of the individual drawer fronts. Each drawer front is cut to an 1/8" less than its nominal size. So there's 2 8 7/8, 2 5 7/8, 2 4 3/8, 7 2 7/8, and 2 1 3/8. The drawer fronts are a 1/4" wider than the corresponding side. That's because, as you can see here, the sides end down against the bottom, while the fronts overlap the bottom. Since the bottom is inset into the front, we need to cut a rabbet along the bottom of the front. So I've set up a dado stack here. The width isn't really important because it's just a rabbet, and I've set it to about 3/8" high. The height actually isn't that critical as long as it stays the same for all the pieces. So the rabbet is 3/8 by 1/4. That way it accepts a 1/4" drawer bottom. Here you can see how the bottom insets into the front. But before we finish this front up, there's one more thing we need to do. We need to notch out these corners so that the sides can inset into them. I can show you that on my other drawers, just like that. This gives me a place to run some nails in the side, and it doubles the glue surface area on that corner. The correct amount to cut off the end of this is going to be 1 3/16. So that's how far away I'm going to set the fence from the far edge of the blade. It fits like that. That fits in there. That's how it's supposed to work. And here I'm just putting that same 1/4 by 3/8 rabbet along the bottoms of all of the fronts, and that 1 3/16 by 3/8 notch in the ends. I'm going to go around the front of this and also along this top inside edge with a roundover bit. And then I also just noticed if I put it in here, it hits these welds on the corners. So I think I'm just going to round over those corners with the roundover bit while I'm at it. All right, all of the components of the drawers are done and ready to glue up. I did run over the top edges of the sides and the backs with a roundover bit as well. All the edges that I'm going to frequently touch are rounded over. The part of these fronts between the notches on the ends is the same length as the backs. So I'm going to put the front down upside down. The whole thing's assembled upside down. Now this is the side. Put a little bit of glue on the end. And on this side, I can set that right into the corner like so. And I'll put 2 staples in this side. And now I'll do that same thing to the other side. Now moving on to installing the backs. This is quite simple. They just go flush across these back edges. To install the false backs the right distance away from the back, I cut this 4 1/4" spacer. Goes in here. That goes up against there. So now we need to attach this frame onto the bottom. And the easiest way I've found to do this is to flip the frame over, put glue all the way around. And I'll set this on here at approximately the right spot and try not to smear the glue around. I center the frame side to side on the bottom, so that should be about a 5/16 offset on each side. So I've got that held in place, and I'll do the same thing on the back. I can flip it over, fire a few nails, and then I can take the clamps off and fire the rest. With 2 nails that can't move anymore, that line indicates where I can fire nails. My stapler was giving me some problems, so I switched to using brad nails. Either one will work fine. All done. I think it's time I mention what's up with these false backs. Anytime you have a drawer that does not have full extension drawer slides, you have to stop pulling it out when it's about 3/4 of the way out. Even if you go that far, if I let this down right now, it'll break the slides because there's so much leverage on that little bit. So you have to leave about so much inserted into the cabinet. But if the entire drawer is just one open cavity, then anytime you slam it like that, everything shifts back. So everything ends up all the way in the back of the drawer. It's tempting to pull the drawer out too far in order to try to reach that stuff. So by putting a false back in here, it keeps all of the contents of the drawer within this area that's acceptable to pull out all the way. It's almost like a mental drawer stop. And I can say, after almost a year of having this workbench, I've never accidentally pulled one of these all the way out, even though there is no stop. Of course, the part of the drawer behind that is still usable. You can just use it for stuff you don't need to access as frequently. Here you can get another look at the process, all from one perspective. On average, these drawers took about 10 minutes to glue up. Pretty simple. I didn't think of it until it was already glued in place, but I could have used a lot smaller spacer between the false back and the actual back. Considering how tiny this drawer is, you could pull it almost all the way out of the cabinet and you still wouldn't be stressing the slides very much. Cute little drawer. I got all the drawers done. Now, they run kind of hard right now. They're a little rough. They tend to bind, and we can improve that. I'm just rounding this edge a little bit to get rid of any burrs or sharp edges that might be causing that drag. I'll do the same thing to that top edge. Now just putting a little bit of wax on those slides. And yeah, I made that look terrible. I probably should have used some masking tape. Much better. Time for some handles. So I came up with this design. Since this part is only 3/8 inch tall, it leaves the whole thing being quite thin, only sticks out into the room 1 1/4 inches, and yet it gives you plenty of room under here for your fingers. 7/8 inch tall by 3 3/4 inch wide. These ends are 1 1/8 inch wide, leaves you enough room that you can drive screws into those without them splitting, although you definitely do want to pre-drill them. So that leaves the overall length at 6 inches. These outside radiuses are 1 inch, the inside radius is 1/4 inch. I cut this out of 3/4 inch plywood using my CNC, but you can definitely use a bandsaw. Or of course, if you don't feel like doing this at all, you can just use an off-the-shelf pull. That'll work fine. Also worth mentioning, if you're cutting a lot of these, they nest quite nicely, so you get a lot of them out of a small amount of wood. If I had been thinking ahead, I would have drilled these holes with the drill press before assembling the drawers. Almost done. All I need to do to finish this up is make a piece for the top and mount the grinder and the frequency drive. I used the grinder to cut out a piece of 1/4 inch steel plate for the top. This is just the exact same shape as the top profile of the frame. And then I painted the edges and the bottom side of it to prevent rust, but I did not paint the top since it's going to be a work surface. It'll get beat up if I do. So I went with a piece of 1/4 inch steel plate for the top. That's not necessary, but It only cost about $40. If you went with plywood for the top, you'd probably need to replace it every couple years because of it being beat up, and once you replace it 2 or 3 times, it's going to cost you as much as the steel did. You could go with a thinner piece of steel, but then you run the risk of it sounding tinny, and we don't want things to sound tinny. So I'm going to go ahead and screw this down. I think I'll just use the same screws, maybe a few more of them than I did in the plywood sides. And I'll use the same method. I'll drill through both to get the holes all lined up, tap the ones in the tube, and drill out the ones in the top a little bit bigger. Oh, and we also need to drill some larger holes where the grinder mounts and where the VFD pedestal will mount. You'll see that pedestal later. I'm using that number 21 bit again to drill through both the top and the frame. Can I borrow your mag drill? I drilled a hole every 4.5 inches, 1 1/4 inch in from the outside edges. All right, that is all of the small holes. Now there's going to be 6 holes that hold the grinder and that VFD pedestal that I was mentioning. So I need to drill those with a 5/16 and then tap them to 3/8. Here I'm enlarging the holes in that 1/4 inch top so they're big enough for the screws. I countersunk those holes so that the screw heads fit flush, and although I failed to get video of it, I also drilled out the 5/16 holes to 7/16. In the frame, I tapped out those 5/16 holes to 3/8/16 so I can use 3/8 bolts to hold down the grinder and the VFD pedestal. And then I went around and tapped out all of the number 21 holes to 10/32. I put one of the 10/32 screws about every 4.5 inches, which seemed about right considering they're pretty tiny screws, and I really like how all the screws look. And now, finally, we're ready to mount the grinder. And right here, I almost knocked the grinder off its blocks. Be careful handling this grinder. It's kind of side heavy and back heavy and just all around awkward. Needless to say, it relieved my anxiety to screw a couple of bolts into it. There aren't any threads in the 1/4 inch steel top, so these are just threaded into the tube below. Until now, the frequency drive was always just sitting here beside the grinder, and that's not the greatest thing because it can move around, so I need to mount it somehow. I was thinking a pedestal that would hold it up here would be just about perfect. Now, you can mount this box down underneath out of the way somewhere and just remote control it. So basically take these controls out and put them in a separate box. But I don't see any reason to do that in this case. I could just mount the whole thing up here, and that way it has plenty of air for cooling. I have a design for the pedestal, but I don't know yet how high I want it, so I'll have to determine that right now. That feels a little high to me. This is the height that I like the best, roughly shoulder height, maybe just a little higher. I recommend you do this. Go ahead and clamp it so that you can determine what you like best. But one other thing to keep in mind is this. You want that to clear. So the height from the table to the top of this, in my case, 24 inches. This piece is cut to 24 inches long, and then the top of it is just angled off a little for looks. So here's the pedestal. The VFD will mount onto this, but we need to mount this down to the table with these 2 3/8 bolts. So I need to cut just a little plate that I can weld onto the end of this to bolt down. These bolts are each positioned 1 1/4 inches in from the edge and 3.5 inches in from the opposite edge. Now this plate that I just cut for the base is just 1 inch bigger than that in both ways, so it's 4.5 by 4.5. And then this corner is cut off at an angle 2.5 inches from these sides. Now I'm going to drill the holes in here to correspond to where these are. If I just weld this tube onto the base, it's going to warp the base a little bit, and then when I bolt it down, it'll pull the tube over and be crooked. So I've cut these triangles. I'll tack weld all of that together before I weld it solid, and then everything should stay square. And it'll make this a little more rigid too. So now up here at the top, I want to put a cover on that just to keep the bees out of there. That's going to be cut out of that same 16 gauge that I used on the back of the cabinet. So now I'm ready to mount the frequency drive here. I'll just set it on there and mark where I need to drill. I'm going to go ahead and mount the post, and then we'll tap those holes and mount the VFD. That's nice and rigid, so now I can take that 1032 tap. All right. I'm going to hold the drive in place with these little 1032 button head screws. The bottom holes on here are actually slots. So I can just set it on there and then use a screw in the top to hold it in place. It's done! Honestly, when I started this project, I wasn't very excited about it because it was just kind of one of those things that had to be done. There was nothing acceptable about having this grinder on top of some 2x8s. And then I thought, well, if I'm doing it anyways, I might as well put some storage under it. But it's turned out to be one of my favorite projects yet. The 1/4-inch thick steel top is going to be a lot more useful work surface than I had thought it would be. In fact, I kind of want a whole workbench like this. This is really nice. This position for the frequency drive is way better than having it beside the grinder. The height of the grinder is much better than it was. Before it was about 4 inches higher, so the table was right here. This is way more comfortable. It's about elbow height. And have I mentioned how nice it is to finally have the grinder nice and rigid? I kind of knew what to expect out of the drawers because I already have a bunch of drawers pretty much identical to this. But yeah, they're everything I expected. One of the advantages of making 2 videos is that I can answer common comments from the first video in the second one. So the most common comment I've gotten on the first video is about dust getting in these drawers. So I'm gonna grind off 1 cubic inch. This is a piece of 3/8 by half flat bar. I'm gonna grind it back to here, which is 1 cubic inch of steel. I'm gonna turn that all into powder and just see where all it goes. I think it should be fairly obvious there's going to be dust everywhere. I mean, this is a very dusty machine, so that's going to happen. But I want to see how much does get in the drawers. Of course, I'm going to be storing attachments and belts and stuff for this grinder in these drawers, so they're going to be things that are going to get dusty anyway when they're in use. So if dust does get into the drawers, I'm not super unhappy about that, but let's see how bad it is. I've seen a piece of wood take a direct blast of sparks for long enough. I'm really not concerned about the sparks damaging the wood. They're hitting with a very low angle of attack. And just as I finish, the belt broke. That looks very intentional, but I promise it wasn't. So, that's a full cubic inch of grinding done. Let's look at where all the dust went. I think it's fairly obvious the majority went in the bucket. Quite a bit of dust does build up on top of these handles, which I don't really like, but I don't know what to do about it. Definitely some down here on the floor and on that side rail, and a lot of dust here and some in the notch. But what we're interested in is inside the drawers. So a fine little powdering of dust there. Looks like we got a little bit on this slide. What about in this drawer? There certainly is some dust in here. Not terribly much. I am a little bit concerned about this on the edge, if that gets blown in there. That is pretty much clean. Yeah, Close to it anyway. And like I said earlier, these drawers are going to be storing parts that are used on the grinder. So the parts that are stored in here are gonna get dirty anyway. Yeah, these are all looking good. Almost nothing in these bottom drawers. So, not bad. Better than I thought it would be. I was also concerned that it might make a little more noise, like it might kind of rumble or something because of the vibration of the grinder. And it does very slightly. I think it makes about as much noise now on 50% as it did before on 60%, which isn't much difference. So yeah, overall, I'm just super pleased with how this turned out, and I'm gonna get a ton of very good use out of this. Thanks for watching.